Hi, I'm Sandra Paulson, a clinical psychologist who's been working with EMDR and complex trauma for a quarter century. And as promised, this is my first brief video, and the topic of this video will be the use of ego state therapy to work with complex trauma and dissociation in conjunction with EMDR. Now, there's a great deal to say on this subject, and I've said a lot of it in book chapters and books and workshops. But here I want to communicate to clients directly, as well as to EMDR therapists who may not be familiar with my work, that for complex cases, there are some very important things that we need to take into account about how the client's self-system is structured. Standard EMDR is extremely effective and powerful and time efficient for treating PTSD. However, complex PTSD and dissociative disorders are characterized by there often being structural aspects to the client's self-system that need to be taken into account. If the therapist doesn't believe in dissociation or doesn't know that a particular client is dissociative, because after all, they don't come in with a tattoo on their head that says DID or quite dissociative, then the therapist may make the mistake of failing to screen for dissociation, failing to assess properly for dissociation using the MID, Paul Dell's MID, or some other appropriate device like the SCID-D. The DES-2 is a screening instrument, but it's not a diagnostic instrument. So the therapist may, with the best intentions, proceed to do EMDR, and the EMDR might either cause the client to feel overwhelmed because it has accessed more than the client has a capacity to tolerate, or the therapy may just be ineffectual and EMDR might, as we say, loop, meaning it's like wheels spinning, stuck in the mud, circling the airport, not going anywhere. And when it's looping, that means that whatever would come up next in the processing, the EMDR processing, isn't for some reason. And with complex cases, that's usually because the structure of the client's self-system is interfering, as if the EMDR is tripping over a dissociative curb. Usually, not always, but usually that's because there are parts of the self whose job it is to protect, and they are doing that in spades. There are a couple different kinds of protective parts of self. One is parts of the self that envision themselves as being protective, and they can be fierce defenders of the client. And when I use the word client, I mean the entire client. I don't use the word client to refer to the front part of a client. And many therapists do, and I think that's an error, because the client is the whole system of parts. So the front part may say, yeah, sure, let's do EMDR, while there are other parts back behind saying, no way, Jose, are we going to do EMDR. Or as one client once said to me, I don't know what this means, but when I was little, I had an imaginary friend, and I haven't heard from her in years, but she's there in my head now, sitting on the curb at the car accident scene, saying, no way I'm going to go through that car accident again. So that illustrates how a protective part of self may think it's dangerous because there's confusion about whether the danger is now or not. The other type of protective part that really happens very often is that it's got a fancy word, it's called an introject. Introjects of perpetrators or parents, which may or may not be the same thing, are parts of self that are almost holographic likenesses of an external person. To the client, it seems like they are the external person. And by that, I mean both the introject part of the client and other parts of the client, including the front part of the client, may, not always, may believe that that is actually the outside parent or outside perpetrator, but it's not. It's part of the client who's disoriented and who believes that the EMDR should not happen, usually because there's a fear that some secret will come out or that it'll be dangerous. Now, those parts of self are there also for protection in a way. They may seem malignant. Sometimes they're responsible for suicide attempts, which to them may be a homicide attempt. But if they think the front part of the client should die, for example, for telling secrets, this is why it's really important for therapists to not push for secrets, and why therapists need to get introjects on board and work with the self system using ego state therapy in order to prevent a suicidal crisis or to prevent an unraveling of the survival strategies that the self system has in place. So those parts of self that stop EMDR are doing their level best to make sure nothing bad happens. Because when they first came into existence, and here's the trick, see? When they first came into existence, it was because it was necessary for survival. A small child had to get with the program and look at their own circumstances through their perpetrator's eyes in order to get with the program and do what had to be done for survival. And in that understanding, of course, even a troublesome introject is protective, just a little disoriented about what year it is, whether the bad stuff's happening now. The therapist has to know if the bad stuff's still happening or not. Sometimes geographic location is a world away from where the bad stuff happened. So these are all things that make a difference. There's more to say on the subject of working with introject, quite a bit more. And it's covered in Perpetrator Introject Checklist in my book, Looking Through the Eyes of Trauma and Dissociation, an illustrated guide for EMDR clinicians and their clients. 2009, available on Amazon. I've also covered it in two chapters, well, various chapters, one with Marilyn Luber, Carol Forgash, chapters I wrote with Joan Galston in the book, The Neurobiology and Treatment of Traumatic Dissociation Toward an Embodied Self, in the edited book with my colleagues, Ulrich Lanius and myself and Frank Corrigan are the co-editors of that. So there's a lot more to say about ego state therapy. I also have a 2-day workshop for clinicians available through sfrankelgroup.com. If you forget that, go to my website and you can find the link there. My website is www.bainbridgepsychology.com, BAINBRIDGE, psychology.com. Thanks for listening. There's more of these brief videos coming up.